And joining us now, Niall Ferguson, author of Civilization, the West and the Rest. He's the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University. It's great to have you back in that chair. Thanks for visiting us today.
Nice to be here, Steve. It's good to be here.
A pleasure. I'm going to list your 6 killer apps and then we'll go from there, okay? So here they go, and it's very, very trendy, I guess, to call them killer apps today, but that's what the kids say, so we'll go with that. Here they are: competition, the scientific revolution, property rights, modern medicine, consumer society, and work ethic. Okay, make the case. You obviously looked at any number of different potential killer apps and you decided on these 6. Why these 6?
Well, when you're trying to explain why for 500 years a minority of human beings become so much more successful economically, so much healthier, so much more powerful than everybody else, you do have to do some serious thinking. And I had to rule some things out. 100 years ago, if you'd asked the question, why did the West dominate the rest, many people would have said it was race. And my book says, no, that's certainly not the reason. More recently, with authors like Jared Diamond, geography has begun to play a big part. And some people would even mention the weather or traditional national culture, national identity. I think all of these things don't work. The key really was the institutions. Those changed in the late 15th, early 16th century. And although it's a bit of a mouthful to say ideas and institutions, therefore I said killer apps, although it sounds like a kind of simple list, these 6 things together, I think, explain the Great Divergence, which put the West into a position of such extraordinary power and prosperity by the middle of the 20th century.
Well, I know some of the criticism you've received about this, and you actually deal with in the book, is, you know, where's freedom? Where's democracy? Why aren't they on the list? So why aren't they on the list?
Well, in many ways, freedom is there. It's embedded in these institutions. But you have to be quite careful about saying democracy is a killer app, because the West became democratic relatively recently, whereas we're trying to explain something that started 500 or so years ago. And I think the rule of law is actually more fundamental to Western success than democracy. In many ways, the rule of law as it evolved in the English-speaking world implied representative government, because it was a rule of law which protected property owners from arbitrary violations of their rights by the sovereign. And in order to make sure that the sovereign stuck to the rules, you got representation in Parliament for property owners. That's really where it all begins in England hundreds of years ago. And when that idea is across the ocean, when it's transplanted to North America, it works even better because property ownership is much more widely distributed. So I think the origins of democracy as we understand it today lie in the way that the rule of law evolved in the English-speaking world, and that goes much further back. That's the real killer app.
And why didn't geography make your list? Because Jared Diamond, as you point out, he's got a whole career going on that.
I think geography explains why Eurasia, the great landmass, does much better over the very long run than, say, Australasia or indeed anywhere else. But if you're trying to explain why one end of Eurasia, Europe, does much, much better than the other end, China, I don't think geography is going to help you, because there aren't really that many profound geographical differences. Another way of thinking about this, Steve, is to say, let's look at the experiments we ran in the 20th century with places that had the same geography, the same national identity, but different institutions. We divided Germany in 2, and we divided Korea in 2. We took the same people in pretty much the same place, and we gave them different institutions. One lot got communism and the other didn't. And in each case, there was amazingly rapid divergence in behavior. So I'm putting my money on institutions, and that's good news, because in a way I'm saying these things can work anywhere. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter your religion, it doesn't really matter whether it's an extremely hot country or an extremely cold country. These institutions can work for you. That's the positive lesson of the story.
Now, your story begins 500 years ago. And I wonder, back in the year 1500, how far behind was Western civilization, so-called, from everything else that was going on at the time?
Well, the way I think of this is in terms of a world tour that you might have done, let's say 600 years ago. Let's go right back to, say, 1411.
Okay.
If you'd gone on a tour of the world then, you would have been far more impressed by China, Ming China, than by anything you might have seen in Europe. Indeed, comparing a city like Nanjing, which was the imperial capital of Ming China, with London, you'd have been shocked by how small and smelly and violent London was. And London was quite an advanced European city. So in the early 15th century, it would have been very, very hard to predict the success of Europe relative to China, because in almost every measure, China looked far ahead. Or, for example, the Ottoman Empire would have looked more impressive to you on that tour. So we're having to explain something that in terms of the early 15th century would have seemed very unlikely, that these nasty little warring kingdoms of Europe were going to essentially take over the world. That's what the book sets out to do.
Part of it, I guess, is not just that we have these 6 killer apps going for us, but the rest of the world, what is it, coincidentally at the same time, was in a mood to destroy itself, or gave us an opening, if you like. Is that part of it as well?
This is a book of world history, not narrowly Western history, and it's not a triumphalist book. It asks the question, what was it that went wrong in these other civilizations, which led them to economically to stagnate, which is essentially what happens in China for hundreds of years. And one answer to that question is that China is highly centralized. There's one emperor who is in a position to prohibit oceanic navigation, which the successor to the Yongle emperor did. There is a simple, single, unified civil service. Anybody with any social ambition has to sit the exam, and the exam imposes pretty strict limits on the way that you think and write. This monolithic bureaucracy was not calculated to encourage innovation. And indeed, the whole Confucian mindset, which the bureaucracy internalized, was designed to promote harmony, not change. Cut to the other end of Eurasia, to Europe, and what you see is fragmentation. Lots of little states, no one emperor with all the power, no single bureaucracy, but multiple competing bureaucracies, and perhaps crucially, autonomous corporations running a lot of business life. The original corporation of the City of London, which is the ancestor of our modern corporations, had no analogue in China. There was nothing like that. Self-governing body of merchants that made the decisions about commerce. So I think it starts with a big institutional difference between centralized bureaucracy and fragmented competition.
That's your number 1 killer app, competition. Right. Do you know where did that come from? The notion that the West would be open to that, but the rest would not be?
I think in some ways it was luck. I mean, it wasn't as if somebody sat down and said, let's come up with 6 killer apps to take over the world. It was happenstance that monarchs in Western Europe were relatively weak and couldn't, in fact, impose their authority on merchants. This simply wasn't true at the other end of Eurasia. Post-Roman Europe had a long period of stagnation. We call them the Dark Ages. I mean, it's 1,000 years, really, from the fall of Rome until things kick off in Europe. So another part of this story is clearly the Reformation. Something changes in the 16th century with Martin Luther, which fundamentally alters the way that people behave. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about this. And then it hit me. It's not just the printing press. It's the fact that Luther insists you have to read the Bible yourself, and you have to read it in your own language to be able to really be a good Christian. Now that's revolutionary, because once you can read the Bible, and once you can print the Bible, well, you can read anything.
You're off to the races.
I mean, I came across this amazing fact, which blew me away. Luther was asked by the good citizens of Basel, should we allow a translation of the Quran into German? We're pretty uncertain that we should allow this terrible book to be published. And he says, yeah, absolutely, you must, because that's the way that we can reveal its errors. Now that mindset that says, let everything be published, transforms the way that Europe behaves and paves the way to the scientific revolution. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, which had been very successful scientifically and mathematically in, say, the 10th or 11th century, a different view is taken. In the Ottoman Empire, printing is banned, and it doesn't actually happen there until the 18th century. And there is a real clampdown on scientific inquiry, with the great observatory of Taqiyuddin being destroyed in Istanbul. So at the same time that the West is getting that right, the rest are getting it pretty wrong.
Let's stick with religion for a second. You've called number 6 app on your list work ethic. Max Weber, I guess, would have called it Protestantism. Can you equate those two things, good old-fashioned Protestant work ethic?
There's clearly a link. And Weber was, I think, onto something when 100 years ago he talked about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It was actually a trip to the US that convinced him this was true. He was in Missouri at the St. Louis World Fair, and he noticed how many churches there were everywhere. Lots of different Protestant sects setting up their churches. And he went back to Germany and wrote this now famous essay. Now, I think he was half right, because I don't think it's a uniquely Protestant phenomenon, the work ethic, even in his time. Even then, Jews in Europe were in fact exhibiting all the same traits that he was talking about: very purposeful activity, working long hours, trying to enhance efficiency. It's not, even then, it's not a purely Protestant phenomenon. But he was right about one thing, and that is the way in which Protestant religions changed behavior towards literacy. And in that sense, I think it's more of a word ethic than a work ethic. Once you get literacy spreading, behavior changes regardless of the cultural setting. So one of the things I try to argue is that if you look at China today, you can see a work ethic in China which is really putting us to shame in the West. And that that doesn't really come out of any deep Protestant tradition, although it's interesting that Protestant churches are making great headway in the most entrepreneurial cities in China, places like Wenzhou. So I think Weber was right that there is some kind of link between a certain system of beliefs that we associate with Protestantism and a changed behavior when it comes to work. But I don't think it's an exclusively Protestant thing. In fact, I think it can work just about anywhere when the incentives change. And if it's all, in a way, it's all about incentives and the way that institutions create incentives to work harder, to inquire freely. I mean, you began by saying it's about freedom, isn't it? And I think in the end it is. But what I'm really identifying are the institutions that promote economic freedom, scientific freedom to inquire, and political freedom.
Do we still have the work ethic?
Well, no, is the sad answer. Certainly not in Europe. If you look at Europe, the extraordinary thing is the decline of working hours per year, as well as the decline in the quality of work that's done and the rising share of people who don't work at all. The best statistic to illustrate this point, Steve, is that the average German now works 1,000 hours a year less than the average South Korean. And that's why when you go on vacation, the Germans are already there. And when you leave, they stay, because they take enormously long holidays, even compared with North Americans. But even here, I think we're seeing a kind of decline of work. Working hours are not as high as they used to be. And many people are in a position of not being able to work as much as they want to.
Neil, I'm showing this for the camera because anybody who carries one of these things around is going to be saying to himself right now or herself right now, what do you mean we don't work as much? We seem to be tethered to work 24/7 these days.
Yeah, but in fact, if you take a look at working hours per year, the West is now significantly behind the East Asian societies. Even if you take the most elastic view of work, which includes checking your BlackBerry when you're in the loo, I'm not sure that's work quite as Max Weber understood it.
Okay, fair enough. Consumer society. How has the development of the consumer society been such an advantage for the West?
This sounds a little trivial compared with modern medicine or the scientific revolution, but it's actually hugely important because without a consumer society, there's no point having an industrial revolution. I was trying to work out how to make the industrial revolution more interesting because it's one of those things that in history is kind of boring but important. If you put it purely in terms of technological innovation, spinning jennies and all that stuff, most students zone out. But then it occurred to me that if I put it in terms of the products, the clothes that you can make far more efficiently with mechanized industry, then people would get it. So I started to ask my students, when was the last time you bought an article of clothing? And it was nearly always last week. And I said, well, that's what I'm talking about. The consumer society is about having loads of clothes. And there's no point having an industrial revolution until you have such a society. Because why bother lowering the unit price of something like this shirt I'm wearing? That's what the industrial revolution does. It just makes this really cheap. There's no point in doing that if the appetite for clothing is not almost infinitely elastic. And trust me, it is. If you don't believe me, take a look at my teenage daughter's wardrobe.
Well, I think you said in the book, blue jeans have been one of the significant battlers of totalitarianism around the world.
You know, blue jeans are an amazing thing, that they are a transformative but amazingly simple piece of consumer art. When you think about it, one of the most amazing things about the Cold War is that a very simple pair of workman's pants, because that's all that jeans are, I mean, designed for Californian prospectors, made to be hard wearing, made out of a pretty cheap but durable fabric, held together by rivets. This simple thing takes the world by storm as a fashion item in the post-1945 period. And that is interesting because it shouldn't be hard to make those. And yet the Soviet system, which was a kind of mutant outgrowth of Western civilization based on the egalitarian theories of Karl Marx, the Soviet Union couldn't do it. It couldn't make blue jeans. The centrally planned economy could make atomic weapons, but it couldn't make Levi's. And that turned out to be a fatal flaw in the design of that Soviet system.
Well, speaking of fatal flaws, do you think the debt levels that consumers are now carrying, what's what I'm looking for here? Well, should we still consider consumerism a strength, given the kinds of debts we're all carrying these days?
I think that's a great question, Steve, because I think in this, as in so many respects, the killer apps are not working as well as they used to. Our consumer society maxed out, especially in the United States, but also actually throughout the English-speaking world, on excess household debt. Now, Max Weber's concept of a work ethic was also a thrift ethic. And you can't really have a stable consumer society without saving. We decided we would experiment to see if we could have a zero savings rate in the United States and have households not only spend all that they earn, but go beyond that and actually borrow to increase the firepower. Well, we know how that ended, and it ended with one of the biggest financial crises of modern times. And that's one of the ways in which I think the West has come off the rails in recent years. The 30 biggest shopping malls in the world today, only 3 of them are in the United States. The rest are in emerging markets. I don't think the consumer society lives here anymore. I think it's in its death throes in that excessively leveraged English-speaking world.
One quote from your book here: civilizations are complex things. For centuries they can flourish in a sweet spot of power and prosperity, but then, often, quite suddenly, they can tip over the edge into chaos. Let's finish up on this. Are you worried about the future of Western civilization?
Yes, I am, and I'm worried that we complacently assume we should be worrying about decline, which is a kind of gradual sounding thing. Maybe our problems will get serious in 2050, but let's leave that for Junior to worry about. That is not how things work in history. I was really struck as I was writing the book by the number of collapses I encountered, all the way back from ancient Rome, which fell apart really quickly in the 5th century, through the Aztecs and the Incas, looking at what went wrong with imperial Spain, looking at the way the Ming Empire fell apart, and then the Qing dynasty after that. And what occurred to me was that things happen really fast. Collapse rather than decline is what you need to worry about. And when one watches what's happening in Europe today, the speed with which the project of European integration is unraveling, I think there's a warning there for North America. Excessively indebted public sectors can implode in ways that right now most of us appear not to expect.
Are we just not paying enough care and attention to the institutions that have got us to where we are today?
Yeah, I think that is the problem. I mean, for example, if you look at the quality of public education in the US, high schools are really poor compared with their Asian competitors. They do not get people to an adequate standard of numeracy when they leave high school. Or look at the rule of law. That used to be really good in the English-speaking world. Now it's a nightmare. In fact, ask anybody trying to do business in the United States, what is your biggest headache? The answer is not, in fact, government. The answer is the lawyers and the compliance department and all the kind of hidden burdens that are imposed by an excessively litigious and over-regulated system. So we have a lot of institutional problems right now, and I think these are there on both sides of the Atlantic, so they're Western phenomena generally. And we're not addressing them. In fact, we're often arguing about completely the wrong things. I'm absolutely sure there's a problem of inequality in Western societies right now, but we're misdiagnosing it. We're not recognizing that one reason that the bottom 20% of the population is getting poorer is globalization and the competition that we are now encountering from countries like China.
Having said that, they want to be like us. They still do. And they want in on our institutions. And they're creating some of their own to mirror what we've got. So do we really need to be that fearful that we're going to be overcome? It sounds like they want to be part of the game with us.
Up to a point. Remember, the Chinese economy will probably overtake that of the US within 5 years to become the biggest in the world. And China has downloaded most of the killer apps, but not all of them. China does not want a system based on private property rights and representative government. It doesn't really want the rule of law as we understand it. And it certainly doesn't want freedom as we understand it. So anybody who wants to sit back complacently and say, why should we worry, they're becoming like us, hasn't spent enough time in China. This is a kind of partial download of Western institutions. It's Asian fusion that we're seeing here, not pure Westernization. And a world in which China is the number one power will be a lot less congenial and comfortable than a world in which the United States was the number one power. People underestimate that at their peril.
Civilization, the West and the Rest. Niall Ferguson, great to have you here at TVO again. Thanks for the book, a really great read.
Thank you, Steve.